Okay. There, now we're official being recorded too. All right, well, I guess we'll just proceed and assume that we're in the right place. And if we're not, then so be it. Then we'll we'll have a very quiet little room, just the two of us.
Okay.
All right, so I guess we should start especially since there are only two of us. My thought for doing this room is really pretty simple. It's that so often when I'm having conversations with people about regenerative issues, I don't find that we're working from the same basic assumptions about what that means. And don't see conversations about regenerative systems starting with that check. Do we all have the same understanding of what regenerative means, right? And if we do, then what's the definition, if there is one? Are there any characteristics that can help us identify such systems? Are there any principles that underlie how they function that can tell us how to put them together, how to build them? And I think you have a very hard time building something that you can't define or don't understand. And that's my concern, is that I see, like in the simple idea of sustainability or what have you, there. Sorry, I'm stirring my coffee. That's why I'm looking off to the side. I just made coffee, so I'm stirring my coffee. Hi, Jane. Is she connecting? Hello, Jane. You're welcome to unmic and partake in the conversation here. We're just getting started because I wasn't even sure I had opened the correct space because I've never done this before. So if you think you're in the so what room do you think you're in, Jane?
I think I'm in the forest room.
Okay, and that's about what did I call it? Regenerative systems, or
yeah, I think regenerative
characteristics of regenerative systems. There we go. Okay, good. All right, then I think I'm confident now we're all in roughly the correct place. So
I'm only going to be able to be here for about another 20 minutes, and then I have to jump in the car. So excuse me when I leave.
Yeah, no problem. That might even be enough. Who knows? It's not really a complex issue. It's just one about do we all feel like we're on the same page about what it is we're trying to do? So here's my thought, is that we would go through, maybe look at a definition of what is regenerative. Is there a definition for it? And see if we can kind of agree on one or not, and share our thoughts on that. And then once we do that, see if we can look at a list of characteristics that we might be able to say, okay, if we're going to call something regenerative, and here we're talking about a community or a society more, then does it have these characteristics, and should it? And if it doesn't, then what does that tell us? And then principles, because we had the level of what is regenerative, how do we know that it's regenerative, and then how do we do regenerative? That's kind of my thinking for the room. And if as I said in the description, if we had more people, then we might, decide at some point to do breakouts about each of these issues or what have you, if there are enough people. But there's only us three, so we'll just go with what we have, I guess. So unless we each want to do a breakout by ourselves and do some quiet thinking on our own, I guess we're already the breakout for now. So let me share with you a thought. What happened with me? I came to all these issues quite differently, I think, than a lot of people do. I noticed that a lot of the same names keep getting repeated in terms of references about who to read about these things and what person has done what important work in the area of regenerative systems, etc. And while I know some of these people or know of and or know some of these people, most of them I haven't actually read. That's not how I came to my understanding of what regenerative is. I came through it through a much more direct route of observation of natural systems themselves, including human systems. And I noticed time after time after time when I'm trying to have a conversation with some of the people that are more educated and come from a more academic background, that there's a certain pragmatism that that where we kind of part ways a little bit in our thinking. And I don't know if this is why, or if it's just that, you know, we each just see things a little bit differently just because. I think there's a real reason for it. I think it's because when you start to try to assess what a system is from where you are now, and that system is maladaptive or broken, which I believe our current system is, then using that as a basis to assess other systems, I think, can be problematic. And our system now is one where we have driven to the point of collapsing the ecosystem. So that isn't necessarily the sign of a healthy system. And so what is a healthy system? And I've thought to myself, well, if are there systems on the planet that don't destroy? Are there non-destructive systems? Are there non-destructive communities, non-destructive societies? And the only ones I could find are indigenous. And so I started thinking, okay, well, maybe that's the model. And but even before that, I sort of accidentally stumbled across the idea for this bioregional way of managing systems, or of managing communities and organizing communities. It was because I was part of Occupy in Detroit, and I was trying to figure out how do we have a citywide meeting, really, with 700,000 people, and you can't. So I thought, well, then we need neighborhood, meetings. And interestingly enough, that group of Occupy Detroit, rejected that idea, which completely surprised me. And then, of course, the idea then was natural enough to go to what about regional or state? And I thought, well, states, but political boundaries are not real. They're fake. They're made up. So what isn't made up? And of course, that's bioregions, or at minimum watersheds, which are usually the same thing, but not always. So I thought, okay, so that makes sense to me. So you have a small neighborhood. If it's a city, then neighborhoods within cities. If it's out in the country, you have like this area, that area, the other area, that form a sort of natural. You try to figure out where the natural boundaries are, based on smaller watersheds to larger watersheds or what have you. And then you end up with this network of small communities, and then those networks connected, and then those area networks connected over bioregion. And that's what we see in indigenous communities over and over and over, all over the world. Doesn't really matter where you look. That's where what you see if you go back in time to the point where they were pre-contact. So if that's true, if that pattern is real, then why wouldn't we copy that same pattern? Why wouldn't we follow that pattern? And that makes much more sense than drawing, imaginary boundaries on the ground and saying, well, let's build a political system here. So that's how I came to my concept of bioregionalism, because I had never heard of the term before. I knew the term bioregion, but bioregionalism is not something I heard until about 2-3 years ago. But I created the regenerative governance model in 2011. And then later, I also learned of Eleanor Ostrom and her work on commons and things like that, and all that again, I was struck by the idea that if you look at what Eleanor Ostrom has to say, it's all great. But if you look to indigenous communities and see how they function, you get there a heck of a lot faster. You don't have to rely on Eleanor Ostrom to come to the same conclusions. It's okay if you do, but I'd rather trust the natural world to teach me than and then get it backed up by academia than to go to academia from a broken system and then say, well, the natural system is wrong if there's any conflict. I'm more comfortable with saying, well, the natural system is got to be more accurate, so let's adjust our thinking to that. And so that's how I came to trust the idea that is that's one of the characteristics of regenerative systems. So there we go. That's how I came to understanding bioregionalism, and I came to the idea of how to do bioregional or do regenerative systems through permaculture first, and then again indigenous systems. And you find that a huge amount of permaculture comes from indigenous knowledge, and so looking at traditional ecological knowledge and looking at traditional societies and how they function, which if they are keeping the ecosystem healthy, maybe they're keeping themselves healthy too, just seems logical. And when you look at how they function, the vast majority of them function and or functioned. Of course, there aren't very many intact indigenous communities left, but there are some, over 100, I think. And you see the same thing. You see the same patterns over and over and over again of egalitarianism, commons, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've come to trust the idea that if you look to nature, you can learn a lot, and then you can use academics as backup for that, and to develop language and words with which to share these ideas. But I default to observing nature first. And luckily, we've ended up in basically the same place. So people are doing good work, and it is mimicking what we see in nature for the most part. So good. So over the years, since 2011, I've of course battled and tried to have conversation with people about sustainability, regenerative systems, how much change we need, how fast we need it, blah, blah, blah. And then climate change comes into it, and energy systems and energy limits and all these things that we're all worried about. So it gets pretty complex. And so I think we need some sort of matrix, some decision-making matrix to help us with these things. And so I started looking at why don't people understand sustainability? And I can very confidently say most people don't. And I eventually decided that there must be a better way to define this that would get people more on the same page. So I wrote my own, and so I'm going to share that with you now. I think, let's see, we have the whiteboard, right? I think the whiteboard functions. So this definition that I came up with can I mean, if you're talking about sustainability, you're basically talking about regenerative systems are interchangeable. So what I want to do is put this in the chat, and then maybe also. Okay, that didn't work. What happened? Let's try that again. Let's do a direct copy and paste and try to put that into the chat. Okay. There you go. Hi, Shant. Hi, Marta and Jane. I'll welcome you all to this session. So that's the definition that I came up with. The use of the ecosystem and ecosystem services in such a way as to allow a community or society to operate indefinitely, resilient to external changes or shocks, without eroding its resource base or ecosystem functions, and to enhance the productivity and natural functioning of the ecosystem. And we can contrast that with the Brundtland definition, which is much vaguer, much more vague. I'll try to use proper English here. All right, take care. Sorry we didn't get around to things faster. So sustainability, this is Brundtland, this is what the world goes by, you know, basically meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I thought to myself, that seems a little too vague. And I think the effects of that come through in what we see around us. You see people talking about renewable energy as if it is sustainable, and yet it isn't. Mathematically, it just isn't. There aren't enough resources for the whole world to all have enough solar to run everything. There aren't enough resources for wind, the same thing, or frankly, any other energy system. When you scale it up to 9 billion people, you just can't live like a middle-class American or even a middle-class European on the resources that are available on this planet. And I would back that up with scholarship from Simon Michaud and others who have done these analyses. But I want to pause right here. Hi, Killian. I am having issues with sound. Oh, well, that's too bad. All right, Marta. Hopefully hopefully it will be okay. You know, hopefully the sound will be good enough to listen to. So are you going to stay? All right. All right. See you, Marta. I assume you're going to go. If so, then we'll see you maybe next time. Yep. Okay. So Shant, well, it's down to you and I. So Shant, do you have any thoughts on what I've presented in the chat?
Yeah, I just came in when you were talking about I think you gave two definitions for sustainability.
Right.
And I found that interesting in that you were saying how the definition of the world for sustainability isn't accurate enough, and then that the potential problems that can cause in people's understanding and how we like end up advocating for change or going about change. And yeah, just the last point you made about how, like, you know, there's not enough resources to run on renewable energy made me think of how there's a real need or a challenge in the world to understand. So if it's not going to be, you know, if we don't have renewable energy to scale up and use for everyone, but we also know that, you know, scaling up how we've done our currently, it has caused a lot of problems, then what is the solution? Because it seems to be like both ends of the spectrum aren't answering the need, you know, or the perceived need. Maybe is that even a true, I don't know. There is an energy problem, it seems. Would you say that? So at least to start off.
Well, right. And so that's why I think these there are other issues we're going to talk about that I don't think you're in the room for, other aspects of this. And so this is where we're starting. And once we look at this, and if the two of us are in rough agreement, at least, that, okay, yeah, this other definition might be somewhat more useful or more effective or what have you, or maybe you disagree and say, no, either one doesn't matter which one. I personally, then we can move on to the other issues, right?
I see. Okay. Wait, so I guess to go specifically on your definition,
yeah, you're right. The top one is one that I promulgate, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the second one is from the Brundtland group or whatever that made one for the UN years and years ago, decades ago. And these days it's even worse in that you hear the triple bottom line definition: people, planet, and economy, which is, to me, not even worth discussing. It should be so obvious that that's wrong, but to understand that, you have to understand how economics actually functions, and that's a pretty deep and intense and big conversation about, is economics even sane? And my opinion on that is nope. And that's pretty easy to support. But that really takes us off on the weeds. We do have 2 hours, at least we're scheduled for 2 hours. So there is time to talk, well, hour and a half now, to talk about it if necessary. But if you listen to heterodox economists like Steve Keen, if you've heard of the donut economics model, if you've heard of the excuse me, the recent, well, it's not recent, it's like 25 years ago, shift to modern monetary theory, which is still a minority of economists, but it makes sense. So if you know of those things, and you have at least the idea that economics as practiced isn't working. And all we really have to do is look at what's happening with current economics, and what's happening is a massive, inequality. That's what's the result of current economic thinking. And like now, and during the pandemic, they gave us a bunch of money, but at the same time, what happened is the wealthy, the super wealthy, got so much more super wealthy during the pandemic, a time that was supposed to be a down period for everyone. These people are getting rich. Off of what? Nobody was doing anything. How did they get so rich? I mean, it's just that, I think, tells us that the economic system just does not function correctly. Another statistic, like in the United States, from the early 1970s to now, real income has basically not gone up for anyone other than the very wealthy. In other words, what we can do with our money has actually declined significantly, because our pay has not risen even with inflation, let alone getting real raises that increase our quality of life. So what's happened is, the cost of living has done this, our pay has done this, and the rich, their money's done this over that 40 years. There's a problem, right? Just basic things. You don't have to understand all the numbers and the math and everything else. You just look at the patterns. We call it pattern literacy in permaculture. Look at the patterns and you can see there's something wrong with this animal. It's not a healthy thing. And so that all those kinds of things come into my thinking. And so I think it is necessary to have a definition of sustainability and or regenerative systems that has teeth in it, that actually has limits, that explicitly states there are limits and we must abide by them. And the outcome must be a healthier system, not a less healthy system. And if it's a less healthy system, it's not regenerative, pure and simple. And so this definition doesn't say you can't have capitalism or whatever. It says whatever you do, you must end up with a healthier ecosystem, over any time period you choose to thing. So I think it's useful to use this newer definition. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Do you think in reading those two, do you see that one is materially more useful than the other, or do we not need to bother?
Yeah, so I think when as I'm reading the definition that you're providing, it's the emphasis on the ecosystem rather than needs, because I think that's kind of one of the main things. For me, reading it is kind of expanding my lens to account for what this ecosystem is, to understand it. And in doing so, then maybe some parameters or things to track can be understood or measured. But first it'd be, what is this ecosystem? Because I don't think most people even really use that term in a social human context to, see it as a lens. People mostly, first of all, it's mostly just typically it's used for, ecology, but then I guess they use it for like industry ecosystems, or now that it's come more into use with like, technology or that kind of ecosystem. But to even understand what that means in a way to see it, because it goes beyond most people's perceptive sense, and I'm expanding my sense to gain a sense of what that means. But I like it, and that's what I gravitate towards.
Yeah, and I think you make good points about what people are perceiving and not perceiving, what they can perceive. And this is why you might not have been in the room when I said this. This is why in my own thinking, I didn't come through academics to get to this point about economics or anything else. I came to it through observation of ecosystems by talking with people about their understanding of things. There's a site called the Oil Drum that used to be active. It's now defunct, but the archives are all still there. And on that website, I was very lucky to have found it because it was ostensibly about peak oil, right? So the peak of oil as an energy source. And thus it also got into things about coal and all these other things, and of course renewables and everything else. And there happened to be people on that site that were very, very good with economics, and happened to be heterodox economists, and said things like, hey, guess what, economics is based on psychology and philosophy. It's not a science in the way that we think about sciences, right? And if it is a science, it's a soft science like psychology. It's not a hard science like mathematics or physics. So that's a problem, because we treat it as if it is this monolithic conceptual structure that is unassailable, and yet it's nothing but opinion. All of economics is based on literally philosophy. That's the core of it. That's where it came from. And much later, they started adding in mathematics to make it more legitimate in the eyes of other scientists. They wanted to be seen as legitimate. But the problem is the underlying basis is still in psychology and especially philosophy. And so they come up with interesting conclusions, like the man who is the primary economist that the IPCC thinking is based on in terms of the effects on the economy. He very recently has said things like a plus 4C world would only lose about 1 to 3% of GDP. A 4C world would only lose a few points of GDP. A 4C world isn't even livable, right?
I don't know what a 4C world is, and who's the guy? I'm curious.
What is his name? I gotta remember. Well, the guy who critiqued him is Steve Keen. And he wrote a paper on that and published it in the last couple of years. Oh, what is his name? I guess I'll go find it for you so that I don't have to just ask you to trust me.
Yeah, I don't know what a 4C world is either, so I was like, just before we
Right. So the 4C world just means a for the planet to become 4 degrees Celsius warmer than in the baseline of 1850 or so. So right now, because of climate change, we are plus 1.2C, right? So the world is basically 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it used to be because of climate change, which is because of our consumption and industry, right? So the guy, William Nordhaus, there we go. Let me come back to the room here, and I'll put a link to that paper in the chat, so you can follow that if you like and read that at your leisure. If you're not that familiar with these things, that paper will open your eyes or be shocking. Even if you disagree with it, it challenges economic thought around climate change pretty strenuously. So
yeah,
we have to. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say thank you for that. And yeah, so the point about 4C, so it's about temperature as a metric for climate health, I guess, or planetary health.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The average, basically the average rise in temperature for the planet. So, so all this is all very long-winded way to get back around to our definition and why it is necessary, because with all these changes happening, we have to have a sensible framework for what we're doing. And the previous definition, the current definition that people use, simply doesn't have any teeth. And so people can do things like say, well, wind and solar are better than oil, which is true in most ways, but not in all ways. It actually is worse in some ways. It actually damages the environment differently than oil does and creates huge problems with ecosystem destruction. You have to destroy, you have to dig that stuff out of the ground. You have to dig it up, right? Especially for the batteries. They're called rare earth metals, right? The stuff they put in the batteries and the generators is pretty rare, first of all. So it's called rare earths. And two, it has to come out of the ground. And so you have to destroy forest or whatever kind of ecosystem you find them in to get that stuff. So there is a new component to ecosystem destruction. And then the waste, what do you do with the waste when they reach their end of life? And we don't recycle all this stuff. We can't recycle this stuff very well yet. And we don't have the systems in place to recycle what we already have. So that's another component, is even if they were renewable, if you can't recycle them, it doesn't matter. You will still run out of those resources because they are finite, right? There's only so much of it. And then if you keep using it and it gets smaller and smaller because you're not recycling it, eventually it goes bye-bye, right? Eventually there is none. And then what do you do, right? If there's no wind, no solar, now what? Oh my God. You go back to coal and oil. I mean, what do you do? So all these things are so connected, it all goes together. And so we really have to get to the point of, and this definition does this, of saying you must not be destroying the ecosystem in order to live on the planet. That's basically what it says. The other definition doesn't say that. It says you can use stuff, just, try to guess what the future needs and don't make it harder for them to live. But how do we know what they need? We don't know what technologies future generations will need. We don't know what special problems will pop up that we haven't ever anticipated. All kinds of stuff will happen that we just can't anticipate yet. So how do we know what they need? How many people will there be? How high will sea level rise go? All these different things, we don't know. So the safest thing to do is to simply not use those resources if we can avoid doing so. Especially since we're going to be running out of a lot of very important resources over the next 50 to 100, 200 years. They'll just be gone. At the way we're using them right now, they'll just be gone. So this idea of consumption and regenerative systems isn't just about stopping climate change. It's about actually having a functioning civilization. We're running out of the resources that we need to run the civilization, because what we can recycle, we're not recycling. And there's about 30% of what we produce that we can't recycle at all. We don't know how yet. We don't have the technology to do it yet. So that's a big pile of trash that's just going to keep building unless we either stop using those things or learn to recycle them. And that trash will just keep building up and building up. And then that gives you yet another form of ecosystem destruction. Where do we put the trash, right? Where do we put the trash? Think about it, 30% of everything we use. Think about how much trash you take out of your house each month or even each week. And think of that pile. And 30% of that staying there and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It wouldn't be very long before your entire house and property is covered in trash. It would be a really short period of time. So all these things have to be thought of, and that's why this definition is important, I think, to me anyway, and that's why it's useful. So then the question becomes, okay, then what is a regenerative system? What does that look like? How can we know if something is regenerative or not? And so then I've been looking at how indigenous systems function, because they are regenerative. They can live and have lived for eons without destroying their ecosystem. They've modified it in many cases, and modified it a lot in many cases, but not in all cases, but in most cases, they haven't destroyed it like we have. Even the monumental architecture thing, civilizations like the Inca, the Aztec, the Maya, even that much technology destroyed their ecosystems. At times they deforested too much, or they caused desertification to happen, or they ran out of water. The water system stopped functioning, or they ran out of water because climate shifts, natural climate shifts, let alone unnatural ones like we're doing now. And so when we get into using technology, we really get into trouble, because we're not managing resources correctly. We're not matching inputs to outputs like nature does. And so I started asking myself, what are those characteristics? And so I came up with a list, and so I'd like to share it with you, and then you can, of course, critique or add to or disagree with that list as you see it. Let me see if I have it. Did I write it down? I don't have it in there. Okay, I have it in my phone, I think. Let's see if I wrote it down here. Definition. All right, I'll just do it from memory. I know I put this. Okay, I can't find it right now. I'll just do it from memory. All right, so when we look at regenerative communities or intact indigenous communities, then the first thing we notice is, how do they organize their lives, right? How do they organize their communities? And they live in small communities. So small communities. So I'll put these into the chat. And those communities are walkable, of course. They're quite small. In the modern world, we probably have a little bit bigger ones, but according to this and other scholars, modern scholars even, there's a concept called Dunbar's number, where he has his own analysis showed that we can't really have good human connections with more than around 150 people on average, and like something like 75 to 150 people. We can know a lot more people than that, but to be really connected to and have an emotional and healthy mental life with, and know them well, 150 people is about it. And we find that in the past, communities tended to stay pretty small in places where they remained sustainable. right? Now, if you went above those numbers, you get to cities and things like that, and they're not sustainable the way we've been doing them. So it's interesting that that matches up, right? That you have this idea of what is sustainable, and is there a size limit to it? And there might be. So small communities, to networks of small communities, they don't live as an isolated community like we do. You know, we have our city, our town, our thing, and even nowadays in the United States, it's like your house is this is it. You know, you don't even have a community anymore. Your house or your apartment is your whole community. And if you do have a community, it's like all over the world via the internet and stuff. And in a crisis, you can't call your friend who's in, you know, Timbuktu and say, hey, you know, I need a ride. You know, you can't do that. So you get into practical limits of how can we help each other if we're so far flung. And so emotionally, intellectually, maybe financially, sure. But can you actually, in an emergency, help each other? And can you actually do work together to have your ecosystem functioning? And the answer to that is no. So we need functioning small communities, but it's networks. So what you find the pattern to be is that there are people that are connected to each other in a group of communities, and that group of communities forms a larger community. And so a lot of things get resolved by this. Like, for example, if you get bored of hanging out with a certain group of people 4 or 5 years, like, oh man, I'm tired of this, or you have a conflict with somebody, you can just go somewhere else in the network. We do that now. We change cities, we move here and there, or we move out of parents' houses, or out of, you know, break up with our friends or girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever, and we go somewhere else. We do that. But in this case, you go to another support system, right? You go to another intact support system, an intact ecosystem, basically, that is all connected. And then that network of communities gets together occasionally and then makes decisions for all of the group. And so they really are connected. They're not just, hi, over there, you know, we'll see you in 5 years maybe, or bump into you accidentally. They actually have connections between themselves and plan at larger scale together. So why don't we do that? Well, we do, right? We have, you know, we have city governments and we have county governments and those kinds of things, but they're not run by us, and they're not connected to the environment and how it functions. And so that's the problem. And we typically feel that we have little or no control of those systems, and little or no true participation in them. But in these smaller systems, you do have control, you do have participation, and you have this decision-making authority, even as an individual. So we have small communities, network together, and they are networked beyond that into regional or bioregional networks, right? So they have boundaries that they live within. And for the purpose of this conference, then we're talking about, you know, bioregional organization. And so I'll add that in as bioregionally bound, maybe. And then when you get down to how do they do decisions, right? Decision making is virtually always egalitarian, some form of group decision making. And there are many, many different flavors and forms of this, but basically group decision making is very, very common in these societies. There's very, very little top-down hierarchy. And where it does exist, it is actually based more on an honor system than on authority. Like the quote unquote chief in these communities, they can't actually tell people what to do. They don't get things done by acclamation, by saying, hey, do this, or threatening people. They get it done by influencing people, by urging people, by getting people, by being very good at getting people to work together and cooperate together. So they're very, very good politicians in the very best sense of it, but they don't have any actual hierarchical authority. And so we've been misunderstanding this for a very long time in Western societies, and Western scientists have been really misunderstanding this. And so they're egalitarian. That's another characteristic, egalitarian. And what about resources? How do they make resources work so that they don't destroy their ecosystem, so that they can have these concepts like, the 7 generations? How do they do that? Well, they share resources. And again, there are different ways of doing this. There's gifting economies where you can have some wealth build up, but then it gets redistributed, to poorer families or poorer villages. The people that are the chief, they actually gain prestige by giving away their good. They don't gain prestige by having it. They gain prestige by giving it away, right? As an example of one way of doing this. And there are other ways of doing it too. Some just plain share everything and do everything together from the get-go. So there's some form of what we call a commons, right? Or a shared economy, where there is no economy in the sense that we mean it. Nobody owns anything. There's no shops. There's no businesses. There's no corporations, because they simply don't need them. They don't buy anything from anybody. They just go get it or make it or use it. And again, they make these decisions together. It's egalitarian decision making. I mean, not at the micro scale. It's like, hey, my bow and arrows are broken. I need new ones. You don't have to go to a council and go, please, can I make myself another bow? It's not that tight of resource management. But on the larger scale, like, hey, how much farming should we do this year? How much of the forest can we cut down? How many animals should we take? Blah, blah, blah. Those things are tend to be, coordinated and organized. And they know their ecosystems really well. And that's another part of it. Is 6, they know, they have intimate knowledge of their ecosystems and how they function. So thus, they can make decisions based on needs. So they have needs-based decision-making, not wants-based. And that way they can keep the ecosystem functioning without overburdening it, without depleting it. Oh, I can't see. So those are kind of related. So I put them in one together. They know their ecosystem really well, so they know how it functions. They know its limits, and they do needs-based decision making, only consuming what they need within the ecosystem boundaries. And if they can, be more consumptive and have a party because there's enough ecosystem, then they'll do it, of course. It's not an idea of intentionally making yourself miserable. It's just a matter of knowing where the limits of the ecosystem are and having the self-discipline to not go beyond that. Because then you destroy your ecosystem and then you die, like we're doing. We're destroying our ecosystem quite literally. We're pulling the rug out from under ourselves, so to speak. So and this next point is really important, because we've talked about how people make decisions together, right? And there's no real hierarchy. And part of that is they have absolute individual autonomy. Right? Nobody tells anybody else what work to do on any given day. Nobody tells anybody else even to go fetch me a glass of water. In these societies, you can't even do that. And you wouldn't think to do it. There's a great story from an anthropologist where he was observing this village, and this one gentleman turned to his son, who's a teenager, appeared to be, and said, hey, go get me some water. And everybody sitting around at that moment was shocked and started teasing the guy and jibing him, saying, hey, ooh, look at the king. Wow, oh my goodness, what a special man you must be. And they tend to use humor as a way of controlling behavior. That's another characteristic. I'm not going to include that in this, but that seems to be pretty common. And so the man got the point and got up and got his own water. So even a father doesn't have the right to tell his adult, quote unquote, son, go get me some water, or even please go get me some water. Even that's kind of frowned on. It's his, go get your own damn water, because he just doesn't have the right to impose himself on other people. So there's a very real right to manage yourself and make your own choices and stuff. And yet they have this massive degree of cooperation through existing in the commons, doing needs-based decision-making together, etc. So it's really interesting that they have this absolute autonomy, no hierarchy, and yet they cooperate very, very extensively. So there's one or two that I know I'm forgetting, but this is good enough. So let me put that there. And those are all the things I just talked about. So there's nothing new in that list that I didn't say. So right now we're looking at, we have that definition, a definition with more teeth in it and these characteristics. And if we take those two and we look at what we're actually doing, even in what is called the sustainability movement or the regenerative movement, you can see that we begin to have some conflicts between these things and what we're doing. Because so many people are saying, well, you know, just build out solar, build out wind, it's okay. Not understanding those things are not sustainable systems, right? We can't make more of them without destroying more ecosystem. And the ecosystem is already teetering. It's already falling apart. We already have 60, 70, 80, 90% reductions in bugs or different plants or animals or what have you, fish, or the sizes of things. The ecosystem is really in deep trouble already. And right now, only a small fraction of the world is using those technologies. So just logically, you can start to see how that might be a problem. And then if you talk to people like Simon Michaud and go through, which I did on Clubhouse, I have a recording of a session on Clubhouse with him where we talk about this. And we can't get more than one generation of even one of these technologies for the whole planet, right? Because right now, you know, European countries, some Asian countries, the United States, we're building out a lot of this stuff, but the rest of the world isn't getting very much, right? And for the whole world to live like an American would literally take 5 or 6 planets. For the whole world to live like an average European would still take 2 or 3 planets. And so we have a very real problem with we simply can't consume that much. So what do we do? And this definition and these characteristics help us begin to understand how we might organize ourselves and how we might change how we organize ourselves and how we use resources to actually be regenerative. And I don't think we can do that without making these things explicit in our minds and having them in our head. But I don't know, do you have any thoughts about the characteristics or anything that I missed or something you would add, or do you think it's nonsense or?
No, it's I like where it's going. I like where it's headed, and it kind of one thing. I like how it all connects, because then one thing leads to the next thing, and you know, in terms of we ended on autonomy and self, you know, regulation and being independent, and you know, when you look at this world, I think a lot of the problems have to do, or at least one thing about them is that we've lost the sense of like integrity. And you can use that word on many different like levels. First, there's like individual integrity, for an individual to have a sense of what their integrity is and to conduct themselves, you know, that kind of been lost, and that you reflected in the environment. What's the integrity of an ecosystem? What's the integrity of a community? And this, you know, this sense of what's a small community in this world. And if we have access to like the globe, then how do we, you know, when you have so much, this information overload, how do you know, gain a sense of integrity? And then, you know, even things like the honor bound thing and having gift economy, these kinds of things, it's like when there is no integrity that kind of gives a sense of what to see and how to see it, then it's hard I don't know, it's just it's kind of like we're at the whims of like how abundant we've become in all the ways that we've expanded. And now we're looking for how to make sense of this and redesign it in a way that's like wise, or, you know, for our survival and continued flourishing. So kind of goes back to the initial point of like, so what do we base our foundational understanding of something on, and you're saying how economics is based on philosophy or opinion, and psychology, but it's running a lot of things.
Runs
But if we
everything.
were to
I mean,
yes, right.
yeah,
But if we were to,
literally.
what do we base it on otherwise? Is it, science, math, ecology, understanding of ecology, or what did these communities based it on? What did they had a, and I think something that I've personally kind of explored, it's related to like these indigenous groups, actually, like the Mayans and stuff. Like there's this one kind of perspective, mostly by, there's several people that have done research into this, but they call it, it's kind of, you can call it the Mayan factor, but they looked at how the Mayans looked at time and how they ordered their sense of time and their calendar system, but also just their conception and understanding of time and how that weaves in with the planet, nature, and the greater cosmos. And that kind of, yeah, that I think that that's kind of caught my attention for a while, of like, as a one way of like, how we're ordering our time and our calendar system, which orders how we, or coordinate things. The current calendar system isn't based on any, even though there are remnants of how it's based on nature, it's not based on that. And when you look at how energy flows to us, even from the cosmos, it comes through in these energetic periods and time and cycles. And so yeah, it's an interesting kind of maybe reframe of what even energy is. A lot of these energy decisions or choices that we have are material. We're looking at the material world and saying, hey, the sun, even sunlight, like it's kind of material, like wind or water. We're trying to manipulate 3D reality, but where are we getting energy sources from? Like there is a imperceptible kind of, you could call it spirit, it kind of ties to the lack of integrity in religion and spirituality that we have right now too. So like we are kind of lost in what to trust, including one another, the integrity in our relationships. That's why we rely on transactional interactions rather than gift economy, because you can't trust that someone is not going to go crazy and like take everything for themselves,
Right,
or like do
right.
some sort of lack of integrity type of thing. And it just kind of goes down to like understanding ourselves and what we are uniquely designed to do and how energy flows within us. And by using that, we can maybe make decisions that can make us feel in integrity, and then maybe that will be reflected in all the other systems.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
you bring up several good points that tie into other aspects of this. And one thing you said reminded me of number 8. Decision making is not time limited, right? Another way to phrase it is they take the time needed to make decisions, whereas we time limit. We say, okay, we have a meeting for 1 hour. Let's get the best decision we can within 1 hour, right? And that is by definition often going to be suboptimal, right? Because we stopped because of a clock, not because we all agreed on it was the best decision, right? And this is an aspect of what you're talking about, tying ourselves to a false sense of time causes us to make bad decisions or suboptimal decisions. Maybe it's not a bad decision, but it could be better in a lot of cases, maybe, right? And I think that ties back into this idea. And then you talked about the overload and people feeling lost and who to trust, and all that comes back to that idea of size of the system, right? It comes back to not knowing the limits of your ecosystem, not knowing your ecosystem at all. You know, we get stuff magically comes to our house, you know, or we get into this vehicle and go and get stuff and back to our house, and we have no sense of where it actually came from. We have no sense of the cost to the planet to do those things. And so I agree with you. We're really isolated in very interesting ways due to time, as you said, and due to the lack of, as you said, integrity of the system. There's no integrity in the system where I can consume as much as I want to and have no sense of the damage I'm causing. That's not a system with integrity, right? And so I like how you frame that, and it all comes back to like Dunbar's number, how many people we can have real meaningful relationships with, what do they know, and all this ties back into complexity as a general point too. When the system becomes too complex that nobody understands any part of it, let alone all of it, you've maybe got too much complexity. And in the conversations I had with Simon Michaud, he made this point very clearly that if you take a phone, you know, nobody on this planet knows how every part of a phone functions. Nobody. There's not one person on the planet that could sit down and make a phone themselves. They wouldn't know how to do it, a modern phone, because it's too complex of a system and it requires all these different pieces from all over, and everyone is specializing. So in a sense, it sounds good because, hey, we cooperate to make a phone. But in reality, what it is we have this complete disconnect from our ecosystem and the effects on that ecosystem and the damage to the ecosystem and connection to the other people we're working with. You know, we have people halfway around the world making components for something that ends up in our hand that maybe our job is part of making that thing, but we don't know anything about those people. There's no integrity to the connections, no integrity to any of it. And there's no real connection to anything. And so how do we understand what we do to the planet with our daily behavior when we have no connection to any part of making that happen? And we have no way to measure it or anything. Certainly not on a personal level. And so, you know, an important part of all this is how do you make good decisions when you're always rushing? When you're always rushing, you're always going faster than is needed to actually come to a decision that everybody agrees on, or at least a large majority of people agree on. And, you know, how do you do that? And just all these connections, just you can see how it just gets frayed. Every angle we start to look at this from, we see how it becomes frayed, how it becomes disconnected and disjointed. And because we're not paying attention to these characteristics, we're not using a definition of what is sustainable that makes sense. We're not putting limits on ourselves on what we consume. We're completely ignoring the ecosystem in that regard and all these regards. And just assuming, you know, hey, yeah, I can get berries, you know, I can avocados from Mexico because trucks, you know, and that's all we care about. Oh, trucks. So thus avocados. So yeah, it's there. So it must be working. It must be okay because the trucks keep coming. So I guess the system's okay. You know, it's kind of this blind thing that we do. I'm being a bit facetious, but it is basically like that. It's like the old joke about, you know, back when we had checks, you know, paper checks. I'm old enough to remember paper checks, you know, I used them even. That's, you know, that's not something anyone maybe younger than 30 would even remember, maybe, or maybe even 40 these days. I don't know, 40 or so, 45, I don't know. But we used to write paper checks for things. And the old joke was, well, I must still have money. I still have checks. You know, that's how we live. We live that way. I've still got checks. Everything must be okay. And so it's a serious problem. Yeah, I really like, yeah, that was good. You brought some nice perspective onto that. So for the next 45 minutes or so that we have, I thought we'd start talking about function and principles. How do how do we actually design things, right? And we don't have time to go through all the principles in detail. So we'll sort of pick and choose a few and try to see how they tie back into the characteristics of regenerative systems, and then the definition itself. And for example, let's take some obvious examples of things that we would not have done if we'd been applying regenerative principles to our decision making, right? So oh, number 9, that gives me that brings me to number 9, zero waste. I knew I was forgetting important things. So that's another characteristic of indigenous intact communities, is they don't waste much or anything at all. They use the whole animal kind of thing. They use the whole plant. What they don't use gets cycled back into the earth in some way. So then it again becomes use. It becomes a positive impact because it's put back into the system. And again, we don't do that. We have landfills, and we dump trash in the oceans, and we dump sewage into the rivers and lakes and oceans. So our waste is going directly back into destroying the ecosystem. So we're very, very, very far from a zero waste society, and that's killing us. We have recently found out that the rain globally, doesn't matter where you go now, anywhere you go on the planet, if there's rain, you're getting poisoned. There are chemicals in the rain everywhere, which means there's chemicals in the water everywhere. And there's chemicals in the soil, on the plants, on the people, on the buildings, everywhere. Forever chemicals, right? These chemicals that we've been using to grow plants, to manufacture things, all this stuff. It is so pervasive in our ecosystem that it's coming down in the rain. And so that's new science from this year. So if we are poisoning the entire planet with stuff that is literally poisonous, and they found that the levels of chemicals in the rain was above EPA standards. It's above what is considered safe in the rain. So we're not even talking about like a pond next to a factory that gets polluted. We're talking about the rain. So we have much bigger problems than I think the too many of us are aware of. And if we don't start pulling back on the ecosystem, we're going to, well, I mean, we can't even predict now what the long-term effects are going to be of all this stuff that we've done. Some people think that the sperm count around the world is falling partly because of all these chemicals that are in the ecosystem already. And so if that's true and that continues to happen, we might be getting to the point where there are no more babies, well, okay, then, what do we do then? That's a feasible problem that might be coming. Then everyone's a test tube baby. So now we need to use a bunch of resources just to have like enough factories to make enough test tube babies to have the population stable, which would be unsustainable, unsustainable use of resources. I mean, you could get into some really freaky, strange future problems if you really let yourself think about it. But let's not really go that far. I don't know that that's actually going to happen, but you can imagine it though. You wouldn't have imagined that except as just a sci-fi story, not long ago. But now that's a real danger. That's how bad things have gotten on the planet. So what are some things that we could have avoided with regenerative principles in place? So nuclear power is a good example, right? So here's Hiroshima, what is it? Fuku, what was it? What's that place in Japan? Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island and all these things, Nagasaki, all these things, they would have never happened if we'd applied the principles. So one of the principles is zero waste, right? One. Another one, and with nuclear power, even setting aside the bombs, with nuclear power itself, we don't know what to do with the waste. Still, we can use some of it. We can use some of it to do secondary things, but there is still waste that we just have to bury. and that will be around for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years often. And so just if you just go with that one principle of zero waste, just that one would have prevented us getting into nuclear power. And so what we might have done instead is then keep it at the research and development stage and not started using it until we had full control of it, until we could apply the principles to it and then use it safely and intelligently. That's just one example. Cars, right? So when we started making cars, the world was still pretty simple. We had a population, around 1 billion, maybe less. And now we have 8 heading towards 9 or 10. And we might not have ever developed cars. We wouldn't have developed cars at all if we had these principles in place to match inputs to outputs, zero waste, right? So if you make a car, then you have all this stuff in the car, and if it gets into a landfill because it's not recycled or whatever, that's waste, right? But that waste needs to become an input somewhere else, and nature matches inputs and outputs. So an output comes here, it's an input somewhere else, right? Nature creates these circles. Some of them are quite long, but a lot of them are quite short, and we aren't doing that. And so just on those 2 principles, and there's 10 or 12, 14 principles that we can talk about, on those principles, we wouldn't have developed these technologies. So then what would have happened? Well, we probably wouldn't have a population of 8 billion people today, because we wouldn't have been able to expand as fast as we did. We wouldn't be able to be as spread out as we are. And we would have then kept making small communities of people that had to travel by train or wagon or something like that if we didn't have cars. And if we didn't have cars, we probably wouldn't have climate change right now, right? Because we wouldn't have been using all the oil and everything that we've been using, and polluted the planet with gasoline and carbon and all these things, the batteries, all this stuff. We probably wouldn't be using them now. So we probably wouldn't even have a climate change problem right now. We'd still have a pollution problem. It'd just be a lot smaller than it is today. But we probably wouldn't have realized that we had a climate change problem yet. We knew the function, how it functions, for a long time. That's like 150 years ago. Scientists figured out the greenhouse gas effect, but it didn't start presenting as a real problem until the 1970s, 1980s. That scientists realized that was actually really increasing quickly and actually affecting us already. So we wouldn't have this crisis if we just had never developed cars. And if we'd followed these principles, we would have, again, remained in smaller city communities or slower communities at least, et cetera, et cetera. And hopefully, been wise enough to live well within those communities. But at least we wouldn't be on the verge of collapsing the ecosystem right now. So what's another thing? So the real reason that we have a population of 8 billion right now and headed towards 9 or 10 is how we changed farming, right? And what happened was, after World War II, chemical companies that had been making chemicals for bombs and the war effort suddenly had no customers, because all the militaries were shut down. They didn't have any more bombs to make, and so those chemicals, ammonia, etc., they looked to farmers and said, you know what, some of this stuff is what plants need, NPK, nitrogen, potassium, etc. So why don't we sell this stuff to farmers, and they'll have these nice big crops, and we'll have more food. Great. We call it the Green Revolution. Suddenly we could grow all this food. But what we didn't realize is, in growing all that food with chemicals, one, we were taking the nutrition out of the food. Food grown with those chemicals has 40 to 60% nutrition. Did I say more? 40 to 60% less nutrition than food grown organically or naturally, right? 40 to 60%. So basically, we think we're growing all this food, but nutritionally, it's only 40 to 60% as much food as it looks like, because there's no nutrition in it. One. Two, we destroyed the soils around the planet. There used to be soils all over the planet that had 5, 10, 15, 20% carbon in them. They were black earth, you know, all over the planet. And people in Asia, Asia's had a huge population for a very long time, millennia, you know, already. And yet they didn't destroy their soils. Why? Because they cycled animal manure, things like that. They put the refuse from the harvest back into the soil. They did burning, all these kinds of things. And really importantly, they used what they called night soils. Night soils were poop and pee. So poop and pee didn't just get flushed away. It went back into the soil. So they were closing that loop. I know it sounds disgusting, but that's how you keep, you know, if you eat the food, that waste has to be replaced. That consumption has to be replaced in the soil. You have to put it back in somehow. It's not magic. It doesn't just magically get replaced. You have to put it back. You have to help it go back in there. And one of the ways to do that is to take human waste and put it back in the soil. And that's what they used to do in Asia. And so they didn't deplete their soils because they use these natural ways of doing things. And of course, there's worms and bugs and all this other stuff. But our own waste is actually a really important part of the cycle. But once they went to these chemicals that were manufactured, using those chemicals is like a person being on crack cocaine or something like that, or methamphetamines. It just burns the soil. It burns up the person. You know how you watch someone who's become addicted to cocaine or to methamphetamines or something, or alcohol, and they just look horrible after a while. You know, they just get less and less healthy. Same thing happens to our soils. And because of plowing and all these other things that we do, it's not just the chemicals, it's also how we manage the soil. We depleted the soils all over the planet. The average soil now on the planet is down below 2%. It was more like 10, 15, not that long ago. Now it's down to 2%. If we had applied these principles of inputs and outputs, you know, if we had applied the principle of natural before mechanical and mechanical before high tech, if we'd applied just those two principles, we would have never gone to this modern agricultural system, and we would still have healthy soils around most of the planet. Just applying just a couple principles would have left us with a very different world. And yeah, it would still have its own challenges, and we wouldn't have as much technology and all that stuff as we have today, but we wouldn't be on the verge of destruction either. And we wouldn't have lost as much connection with each other as we have lost, et cetera, et cetera. So when you take all this stuff and put it together and you look at these characteristics, you look at some of the principles, you look at the definition, if this is in our heads when we're doing decision-making together and we're doing planning together, you're going to get different outcomes than if this stuff is not in your head, in my opinion. I don't know. I don't know if that was clear at all. I tried to give examples that are obvious, but then do illustrate how we take the first principles plus the characteristics plus the definition and how it all works together. So I don't know. Any feedback or additions or?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing that has been in my mind, and then I want to like see if anyone else here would like to, you know, talk. But one thing that I have been thinking of, so like, yeah, definition, characteristics, and these principles. This is kind of like a way to, you know, this is the knowledge or the result of what we've come to after all the stuff, because a lot of the things that you said were like, you know, if we hadn't done this, then we wouldn't probably have gotten there. but the fact is that we did do it, and it did happen, and that's where we are now. And so in some way, there's like, I feel like there is some sort of like like super beyond the individual, like beyond our understanding, like wisdom of like why things have turned out how they did. And like we didn't, it wasn't for the best, it seems like, but maybe there's something that we're not seeing of like why we've done it, and we got to figure that out. Like maybe there's a reason why we have made all this technology and we've come to this point of like brink of self-destruction, because we're trying to understand ourselves on a level that we wouldn't have been able to before, or like there's some change happening. I feel like there's something there that it's like if we would have been better by not doing it, then why did we do it in the first place? And if we have done it, then what are we here to like learn through doing it, you know? So there's something there that is very interesting to me. And you know, that's where, you know, these kinds of what we have learned and how we can adjust from all the understanding of like through this, what you're sharing, can help us see how to get out of it or something, you know? So that's what I'll share. And I don't know if anyone else here, I'll keep some space. Yeah.
If anyone else wants to come off mic and comment, please do.
Hello.
Hello.
You listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, that's good. Just give me a second to connect my camera.
Sure.
Is that good? Hello, everybody. I think there's a lot of things that we can grab from these kind of thoughts. Like for me also, like why evolution, like in other words, will be why evolution got us to this place. In my perspective, there's like duality, like the same as the tree goes down in the roots to the deep soil, where there's old soils and there's like a lot of knowledge. It grabs itself from these past soils to the light, to go higher to the light. And that's just how you say it in English, metaphor, to understand that also you have to go to your past and to a process of learning of I don't like the word error. I think, or guiltiness, or feel like there's no errors in this life if you don't grab that you're in the process of the learning. And in that process, you sometimes need to, I don't know, to do things that are not the best. Or for an instance, right now, still we are thinking about electric cars and all of the electric revolution. From what I know, all of these minerals come from islands in the middle of nowhere, where they are pushing out communities and things like that. Like it is a crazy thing, but it's happening. So people want to be more ecological, and then governments are putting more ecological politics. But like you were saying, Killian, like we don't know where things are coming, so we're kind of like blinded in this possibility. But going a little bit there, I believe, and from my experience, 37 years old and working in permaculture since like 15 years ago, I have realized that you have to start home and hopefully a little bit more local, and then you scale up, like walk the talk. And a lot of us here, and it's really difficult. I still use my car. I build gardens. I have to move materials with petrol and who comes from other places, but in the process, try to be as best as you can. But in the big thing is also like what we are proposing. I don't know what you, but most of permacultural and deep ecological communities is a simpler way of living, and it goes in the contradiction of a upgrowing forever and really fast going industry. I want to have my cell phone. I don't want to have the best one, but I really right now I need it. But I hope that one of these days I reach to the place to build a certain kind of community where I don't need a phone anymore, because then, like you were saying, the number of people who I can really have a good connection or a Dunbar number, like where people can be really connected and have a little bit more of a meaningful relation, but is a little bit smaller than what we can have in likes in our Instagram right now, for instance. So
Right.
so I think kind of the deep ecological proposal goes against a lot of things, and the outside people usually will tell you, I don't know this word in English, but it's called retrogrado. It's like try to walk backwards, like you're trying to go to the, I don't know, to the paleontology era or to the hippie era, like you're going backwards. I don't know, we call it retrogrado. It's like going backwards. And retro
something.
yes, yeah,
Retrograde.
like retrograde. Thank you. So I think there's a lot of questions in this case, like if humanity have to fail that much to then choose things that are not good, and that's, I think, like human beings have done, or at least I have been adventurous enough to also see that some adventures that I took there were not a good path for my health or for different things. So, but basically what I will point out is I think we should start walking the talking, because it is the more loyal way to really speak a big truth, because we are living it, at least trying to get into it. So if humanity is here because of this, of that, and that kind of philosophies are really good, but I think we should really go back to ourselves in a way, and the people surrounding, and the basic first community that they're trying to build on. I don't know how to say it. I'm trying to go more into the action and a little bit less into the philosophical in this one. This is something that it also have, like, I don't know, hit my existentialism, but I try to put it a little bit, like lower the volume and try to be more active with it. I don't know if it works.
No, I like what you're saying, and that's kind of the point. There's a lot more that I often say when I have this conversation or do presentations about this stuff, like on Clubhouse. It's a 2.5 hour thing of me just me talking for 2.5 hours, without any discussion, right? Because you have to go into all the whys, like climate, ecosystem destruction, blah blah blah. But then, like the stuff you're talking about, it's like, then what do you start doing about solutions, and what does all this really look like? All I'm trying to do in this conversation is for us all to have a conversation about how do we frame this is just to frame our conversations, right? This is just to give us a framework, a shared framework to think about. And it takes this long to have this conversation. We've been in this room for an hour. We started late because I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but so probably an hour and 15 to 20 minutes just to get through this stuff and have just a little bit of conversation. So we need to make space for conversations like this, and to get ourselves on the same page where we're understanding that we have to bring things back to, as you said, that simpler way of thinking and doing. And so I tell people all the time that if we're going to keep making decisions based on ideology, beliefs, morals, ethics, any of those things, none of them are universal, right? None of those are universal. And so whatever choice is made, it's one group imposing on another group what they believe to be true. All of this is universal. This applies to every human. This removes anyone's religious beliefs, or removes their any of that morality, and all of it, just by getting down to very simple first principle type thinking. We can avoid all those conflicts and just say, how do we do it? Stop asking why. Don't stop asking who should be allowed to eat, or why should any of it be allowed to eat. The question is, how do we feed everybody? It completely changes the thinking if we go this route, in my opinion. At least it allows me to go that way. That's how it frames it for me. So I don't know. So Elif, you're on camera. Did you want to say something or add to it, or tell me I'm stupid or anything?
No, of course not. So interesting, like my background is sociology and I'm just new in this area, like this topic. I recently completed my EDE and I was just attending this constellation where I was having a chance to speak to a star and also the land of Netherlands, which is very interesting experience. And then I jumped into this conversation. And I was very much focused on zero waste for 2 years, and especially in the individual, on the individual level, on the personal level. So that's interesting. You said that like we should start with the smallest circle. With I can also say that we should start with ourselves, which is also a community. That's what I have heard and also experienced, that like there is a community within us that we should align first. So I have some questions regarding that. If we are trying to see the whole thing as a whole, then the current situation is the expression of the consciousness itself as well, the consciousness that we say, the one big consciousness. So the climate change is as where we are holding it exactly. Is it a consequence of human action? Or is it a part of the consciousness expression of at the current level? So it makes sense that like if we are seeking the problem from the time and space limitation, that's a dangerous thing is going to happen. That's a risk that is eventually potentially will kill the humanity. And then what we are trying to do is right now the shift the consciousness, shift this understanding and recognize that, oh, okay, that the game that we play actually here is threatening our very own lives. The nature will handle it. The thing that I think we are kind of worried about our own legacy. and here I consider, I've been trying to change the people's behavior in daily life, consumptions, habits, which I can explain sociologically, blah, blah, but like in spiritual level, I think there is the level of understanding that we should take an action, and it is not apart from the self-work, the personal, psychological, spiritual work. But we need to reach a point that we should accept that, like it's very complex, it's so many dimensions involved, and I'm kind of sometimes lost, but I can still make sense the effort that we are trying to change the whole thing. So it's not a question, it's just a comment, or I'm just talking my mind to you.
No, I think it's a real problem, is this issue of consciousness, and I don't even talk about it. As I just said, I keep focused on function, because function is universal. Principles are universal. You know, like first principles are a universal framework for every human being. This doing it this way and using these characteristics, you know, paying attention to those characteristics, and thus making your decisions about your ecosystem, all that's very functional. That's math, it's science. You know, we're talking about indigenous people, but they did really excellent science and still do, you know. And so by keeping it at the physical level, at the natural level, then you can, you know, locally have bring back in some of this stuff about, you know, beliefs and all that stuff. You know, maybe we get bored with just talking about, hey, look at the banana. Well, maybe the banana's alive. Okay, that's fun to talk about. I don't know. You know, I think that's part of why we do that, you know, is that we kind of get bored with everyday life. You know, we built a hut last year. We're building a hut this year. I mean, come on. Let's liven things up a bit. Let's have some ayahuasca or something and get crazy for a while, you know, whatever it is that we do. But I really think that what indigenous cultures have been very good at is kind of exploring that spirituality. You know, like so many of them have this idea of the multiple genders, for example, that now in modern society are so horrible and bad. Oh my God, you're male or female, you might be both or maybe 3 other things, who knows. In those societies, they don't care. We care about it for some reason in modern society. Why? I don't know, but for some reason, some people do. And I think they were just somehow were so connected to their ecosystem that with that being the foundation, the crazy didn't make them crazy, and kind of just the opposite. It maybe just kind of gave them, made their lives more lively, more fun, more interesting, more playful. But for us, it makes us crazy. It makes us hate each other and stuff. And it doesn't happen in those societies. So why? Maybe it's because of these basic ideas of being connected to a small group of people that you know really well. And so it's very hard to hate people that you know really well and depend on, right? That you depend on, that you have to work with and cooperate with to solve problems. And you can't just blow those people off. Having human waste in the system is just as bad, if not worse, than having physical waste in the system, right? Because a human who's unhappy and broken can very quickly disrupt an entire village or network of villages very, very quickly, very easily. Whether it be directly through harming others or being a drain on the system, being disruptive, or damaging the ecosystem in a selfish way, because, well, screw you if you're not gonna, if I don't get to be part of things, then blah blah blah. Or they get outcast and die or something. So people are pretty careful about their behavior in these societies because they depend on each other, and it can be very, very, it stays very, very pragmatic, I think. And I think it solves a lot of that craziness, and they are connected, right? You don't see, as far as I can tell, and you're a sociologist, so maybe you tell me, you don't see the same levels of mental illness and emotional illness that we have in the modern world. And I think it's because of that connection and meaningfulness of what we do. Our work is not meaningful to living. It's not meaningful to being human. It is abstract. You work in a bank so that somebody else can make a lot of money, not so you can make a lot of money, so somebody else can, and they can consume, and you are living paycheck to paycheck. It's keeping you alive, but it's not really a great thing to know that your work is supporting someone else much more than your own family. It's hard for us to deal with, I think. And the insecurity of it. You lose your job, your family's screwed. They no longer have food, no longer have water, blah blah. At least in the United States. In some other countries it's better because they have better social networks, social support, but in the US it's horrible. You lose your job, you're in deep trouble in the US. So I don't know. I think you're right, in the sense that we have all this angsty stuff, but I don't think that. I think the cause and effect is that nature first, and when you stop doing that, then you get into all these other issues because you don't have that basis to bring you back to reality, to refocus your decisions. When your decisions have to come back to the principles and the function of the ecosystem always, I think it keeps us from getting too crazy out there with other things that we could, get indulged in, which we do in the modern world: drugs, alcohol, all this stuff that, again, indigenous cultures don't tend to have a big problem with drug use or alcohol or any of that stuff, but we do. And so the question is why. If all this modernity and complexity is good for us, why are we getting less healthy? Why are we getting less connected to each other? Why are we more violent? Why, all these things. People like to try to tell you, especially, old anthropologists and archaeologists, that indigenous people are really violent, but that is now known to not be true. That's not the case. They actually go out of their way to limit violence, and they don't get into massive scale conflicts like we do. Of course, they're human, so there are conflicts, and people even get hurt and killed, but they don't have wars, big, massive wars like we do. Now, the Aztecan people did. I'm not talking about that kind of indigenous. I'm talking about small scale regenerative indigenous. The Aztec were not regenerative. They were modern. I consider them part of the modern era, as an example. Once we got into monumental building, things kind of went crazy. It's just that it was so slow for so long that it didn't necessarily destroy the ecosystem and destroy society as much as it does today. Anyway, those are my thoughts in response. I think it's a lack of connection to the earth that allows these issues to come up. But I'm not indigenous either, so, you know, maybe I'm talking out of my butt.
May I add something here? Are we on
Yeah,
time,
please.
or is this gonna close soon?
We have 10 more minutes. I'm not allowed to conflict with the main plenary. This has to close in time for before the plenary starts.
Well, I really appreciate it. I think I enjoy this kind of discussions. I really also like when Elif brought this sense of one consciousness, or at least in my journey, I have also practiced Aborigines practices from the South American and North Mexico. And not only the sacred medicine, but a lot of the other things, the cosmovision understanding. And I really appreciate it in how everything is nature reflected. To put it in there, like this is not about what I'm going to talk about here, but I understand what you're saying. And part of my life have been, or one of my first aha waking up moments, to not go too deep, was with a tree. Like I have this conversation with him, or he told me something. Just to put it in a way, and in my life I have been trying to promote the spaces for people to find their own way connecting through nature. I'm just opening it here. And Elif said something really interesting. Other experience that I have lived in my life have also really felt, make me feel and get to a level of consciousness of oneness. Like really, and you talked about ayahuasca. I don't know if you have. I have tried really in a spiritual, really deep process, like really, and you really get to the chance to feel the oneness. And a lot of people come down, and maybe they have never in their life, or they were Catholic, and they usually say, "Man, I really felt on my first life, on first time in my life, oneness." So what I can grab here from Elif is like she's saying, are we victims of the big conscience doing, like having us as, not as puppets, but as laboratory rats trying things, and then we come back to our home and try to say, hey, well, I had this experience with this thing, I came back to. It's really beautiful. Like I also love philosophy, and I went into there and quantum mechanics. And I remember one day one guy told me that it was consciousness who drive this world. Like it is bananas who really make themselves delicious for us to be reproducing them as consciousness. So our bananas are telling us, hey, take me, I'm really delicious, I'm sweet, so plant me more and more. And all of these consciousness are trying to reproduce as much as they can, like zeros and ones, if you want to see it as matrix. But also you can see it. So what I want to be here, because we can jump into more philosophy and more, I don't know, layers of the onion, like quantum physics says, and most of the science define itself in language and in word between the object and the subject. Like there's an object in science, but the book never told me his name is book. So words, yeah, like so we are trapped. First of all, we should be conscious that we're trapped in language and not trapped. We are amazed, and we have this amazing tool, which is language, but it also can hold things in a perspective. So we are gonna enjoy this discussion. So what goes beyond, sometimes I like to keep it in that hidden place between the subject and the object. That's what quantum physics says. It's like what the subject really can mix there. And then I can really say that connection with nature is that middle point. Like I don't know if you have felt telepathy, or there's a lot of things that are in cartoons or they are in some stories, but I have picked up my phone several times and I say, well, I need to call my mother, and it's my mother calling. And there's other things that have happened with snakes, trees, and all of this connection. My belief is also back to that connection, but it can sound retrogrado again, or retro engineer. I don't know how to say it.
No, actually, sorry, go ahead.
So just to grab it, I don't know. I have also worked in education and sociology. I'm an architect, but I work in urban gardening education, or that's the step that I chose to try to make a change. And what I have found out, that most of the people there, or most of the people surrounding in the city, they have a lot of, they're really afraid, because our educational system say that whatever you don't know, please don't try it. You're not so for me, using words, I will say education is really, really important. And I will bring another one really important, which is start your own personal process. And through example, like if you want to change the world, change it yourself. I don't know how to, like, I don't know, like I have tried a lot of things, organize neighborhoods, organize cities. I work in government, making politics, and it's a big thing. And it gets really complex, like you're saying. And there's trillions of roads, but basically like the biggest change or the biggest satisfaction in this place where you can say, well, the world is falling into pieces and I should take off my life, is a little bit more of, man, be satisfied of your own first being. And from there, I think nature give you the flow. But that's what I can, I don't know, in words, give to this small chat. Thank you.
I like what you're saying, and I think that, and Shant actually said something similar to what you two have said earlier also. So there's a certain synchronicity to the thinking here, and I do believe in the connection of people. So I didn't mean to imply by what I said that there is no sort of human, awareness thing. Scientifically, we know that our brain waves extend up to 3 meters out from our heads, right? So if any two people are within 20 feet of each other or so, they're probably creating a neural network that they're not aware of. And my belief is that these things that we call intuition, partly, but more so that precognition and that kind of thing, part of that is just subconscious stuff that we calculate. But part of it, I think, is that connection between people. We are a massive human computer in a sense. And so when people talk about consciousness, I think that's what that is. I don't think it's this stuff out here. I think it's a very real connection between humans, where when we're in proximity to each other, something different happens because of the interaction of the brain waves. And of course, then there's the physical stuff, the real physical communication, etc. And it all, to me, it all is that's how that happens. And I think that's part of why we do come up with things like spirituality and things like that, to explain this weirdness of, how did I know you're going to say that? We didn't have any way to explain that, in the past, but now we do. And so the mysteries are disappearing somewhat, and we're kind of creating new ones. But it is all connected, I think, and that's really important to understand. And that if that connection, I think the upshot of all this is, if we're looking at nature's rules, following her rules, and paying attention to our connection to that and the people around us. And so when I say nature, I mean humans and nature. And I sometimes frame it as human nature with a small h, big N kind of thing. Like, human nature to me doesn't mean like how humans are. It means that humans and nature have co-created. We have co-created with nature for going back at least 85,000 years that we can document, where humans have changed the environment intentionally for at least 85,000 years. And so there is no space on the planet other than Antarctica that isn't shaped by humanity. And of course, most of that's erased in Eurasia, but certainly in the Americas and Africa and Australia, up until just a few hundred years ago, most of that was still visible. It was still intact, and we could see it, and there's documentation of that. So we got to close down because we're 1 minute away from getting into the plenaries, and they'll yell at me. But if you guys, I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you if you want to do a second session about where do we go with this stuff. That'd be great to do. I guess message me or somehow. There's ways to connect, I guess. We can do that. I'd love to do that, to look at next parts of this conversation. But right now we got to close it, or they're gonna yell at me.
Thank
All right,
you
so thank you.
much.
No, thank you. I thought I was going to be here by myself for 2 hours. I set this up at the last minute, and the guy was telling me, no one's going to show up, man. There might be nobody there. And I'm like, okay, no problem. I'll talk to myself for 2 hours. I can do that. So I'm so glad you guys came, and you made the conversation so much richer and really beautiful. So thank you. And take care, and hopefully I'll bump into you again in over the next 2 weeks. And yeah, if you want to do this again, just next part, let's do it. Let me know. Cheers.